Right now, as you're watching this, American forces are being positioned for what could become the deadliest mistake in modern military history. And the scary part? Most people have no idea it's even happening. Imagine sending construction workers with hand tools to demolish Mount Everest in 24 hours. Sounds absurd, right? Well, that's essentially what's being planned right now in the Middle East. Except instead of construction workers, we're talking about your sons, your daughters, your neighbors in uniform. And instead of Mount Everest, we're dealing with a nation of 93 million people protected by mountain ranges and deserts, armed with weapons that can reach out hundreds of miles. But here's what really keeps military analysts up at night. The economic shockwaves from this conflict are already pushing us toward recession. Every few days, we hear reassuring statements trying to calm the markets, trying to convince everyone that things aren't as bad as they seem, that this won't last long. The strategy is simple: manage perception, control the narrative, keep people believing that any day now there will be a sudden collapse and surrender. But what if that doesn't happen? What happens when reality catches up with the optimistic projections? Let's talk about what nobody's discussing at your dinner table. The global economic impact is absolutely devastating, and most Americans are completely unaware. We're looking at potential famines breaking out within 6 to 12 months across Africa, South Asia, and the Middle East. Why? Because modern agriculture depends on four critical things: fuel, food, feedstock, and fertilizer. Without fertilizer, you can't grow food at scale. The green revolution that fed billions is being reversed right before our eyes. Think about that for a second. We're not just talking about gas prices or stock market fluctuations. We're talking about the potential starvation of millions of people because global supply chains are collapsing. Now, here's the disturbing truth about public attention. If 10 or 15 people are killed or wounded on any given day, most Americans won't look up from their phones. That sounds harsh, but it's true. People won't miss Monday Night Football or their trip to the convenience store over casualty numbers that seem manageable. But if we lost 4, 5, or 600 service members in a single day, that would shatter the illusion. That would force everyone to acknowledge we're in a real shooting war. And that's exactly what's being avoided. The entire game in Washington right now is convincing the public this isn't really a war. It's just a limited operation, a necessary action, anything but what it actually is: a regional conflict with the very real potential to go global. The only reason Americans aren't paying attention yet is because the enemy hasn't inflicted mass casualties. But military strategists will tell you that's not a sustainable situation. It's not a matter of if, but when. Right now, there are plans for 15 different potential operations using ground forces. The locations range from various islands to possible incursions into mountainous border regions. But here's the critical question nobody in authority wants to answer. Is there any ground operation with the number of troops being discussed that could possibly achieve objectives worth the blood that would be spilled? We're talking about a country 4 times larger than Iraq, a country that's expecting ground forces and has mobilized well over 1 million troops, a country with sophisticated air defense systems and precision weapons. Sending forces into that environment with limited numbers is like attacking Gibraltar with jackhammers and expecting to move the rock in 36 hours. It's not going to happen. The rock isn't moving. This gets to a fundamental strategic problem. You're trying to use air and naval power to lay siege to a massive continental power protected by natural barriers. How do you inflict enough damage to achieve your objectives against 93 million people spread across deserts and mountains? And this is where things get really dark. There's been talk of expanding targets beyond military infrastructure and oil facilities. There's been mention of attacking desalination plants. Let that sink in for a moment. Desalination plants are what provide drinking water to millions of people in desert regions. There's one particular plant outside a major capital city that's absolutely enormous. Without it, that city cannot exist. They're already planning for the high probability that plant will be destroyed and they'll have to evacuate over 1 million people or watch them literally die of thirst. And that's just one city. Across the entire Gulf region, there are roughly 50 to 57 desalination plants. If those become legitimate military targets, and if retaliation destroys similar facilities on the other side, you're looking at millions of people facing death by dehydration, not as collateral damage but as a direct result of deliberate targeting decisions. This is what modern warfare has become, and it raises serious questions about whether any rules still apply. Now let's talk about the actual military operations being considered. Most naval forces are currently positioned 500 to 1,000 miles away from the primary area of operations. Why so far back? Because ships that get closer become targets for weapon systems that can engage from hundreds of miles away. So, how do you get troops from ships 1,000 miles away into contested territory? You'd need helicopters and aircraft flying long distances over hostile airspace. How do you do that without being detected and immediately targeted? And even if you somehow manage to get forces on the ground, then what? How do you sustain them? How do you evacuate wounded? How do you provide food and water? If you're planning to fly everything in, every aircraft becomes a target for extensive air defense networks and precision guided weapons. There's historical precedent here that should give everyone pause. Back in the early 90s, a famous general refused to authorize certain operations because the casualty projections were unacceptable. He turned down requests for amphibious assaults and airborne operations because he calculated the losses would outweigh any potential gains, and that was against a far less capable opponent with far less sophisticated weapons. What we're looking at now is exponentially more dangerous. We're talking about an adversary with intermediate range ballistic missiles that can drop on ships trying to navigate strategic waterways. We're talking about air defense systems that can engage aircraft at extended ranges. We're talking about a prepared defense with interior lines of communication and overwhelming numerical superiority. Some of the operations being discussed would require forces to travel over 400 miles in straight line distance just to reach potential targets. Every mile of that journey would be over hostile territory that can be covered by air defense systems. Any military planner looking at a map can see the vulnerabilities, and if planners on one side can see them, you can bet planners on the other side have prepared for them. The risk level for operations like this would be classified as unacceptable by conventional military standards. It's reminiscent of operations from World War II where paratroopers or other forces were dropped or inserted far ahead of advancing lines without adequate support. What happened in those cases? Heavy casualties, forces cut off, soldiers killed or captured. The fundamental problem is a consistent underestimation of the opponent's capabilities. This has been an issue from the beginning and it's a potentially fatal mistake now. When you underestimate an enemy who has sophisticated weapons, interior defensive positions, numerical superiority, and the motivation of defending their homeland, you create conditions for catastrophe. During a recent press briefing, a reporter asked a direct question about potential attacks on civilian infrastructure like electrical plants and desalination facilities. The question was basically whether there's any way to destroy those targets without seriously harming civilians. The answer was bureaucratic double talk about developing options to mitigate risks pursuant to normal military practices. But what does mitigating risks mean when you're talking about destroying the infrastructure that provides electricity and water to millions of people? How do you mitigate the risk of mass civilian deaths when you're deliberately targeting the systems that keep them alive? The general giving that briefing is a career officer doing what he's been ordered to do. From the perspective of certain military theorists, this represents an opportunity to validate air power's ability to win wars through strategic bombing. We've been down this road before. In World War II, in Vietnam, where 2 million people died, the logic of violence takes over when wars drag on and you can't achieve objectives through conventional means. You escalate, you expand targeting, you accept previously unacceptable civilian casualties. But there's a critical difference this time. The other side has the capability to respond in kind. If desalination plants become legitimate targets, then all the desalination plants in the region become targets. If oil infrastructure is fair game, then everyone's oil infrastructure is vulnerable. This isn't a one-sided bombing campaign where only one side has strategic reach. The implications extend far beyond the immediate combat zone. Destroying oil infrastructure and critical chemical plants affects the entire world's ability to produce fertilizer. Without fertilizer, agricultural yields collapse. Food shortages follow. Within 6 to 12 months, you're looking at famines in regions that depend on industrial agriculture. After World War II, the international community tried to establish rules for warfare. The Geneva Conventions and laws of armed conflict were supposed to ensure that even in war there were limits. You could fight viciously, but within certain boundaries. Targeting purely civilian infrastructure with no military value was prohibited. Deliberately causing civilian suffering was considered a war crime. For decades, these rules had at least rhetorical support, but increasingly it appears they've become dead letters. When you hear casual discussion of destroying water systems and electrical grids that serve civilian populations, when the response to questions about civilian harm is bureaucratic evasion, it's clear the old constraints no longer apply. Part of this comes from adopting the warfare philosophy of close allies who view current conflicts as existential. When a nation believes its very survival is at stake, restraint disappears. The approach becomes total war, transforming enemy territory into uninhabitable zones. If that's the price of victory, it becomes acceptable. The problem is we've adopted that mentality for a conflict that isn't existential for us. This isn't about American survival, but we've committed to fighting as if it were, which means accepting targeting philosophies and casualty levels that would have been unthinkable in previous conflicts. There's also a human element that gets lost in strategic discussions. Soldiers are taught rules of engagement and laws of war. They're told to fight hard but fight fair, to distinguish between combatants and civilians, to treat prisoners humanely. That moral framework is important not just for legal reasons but because it maintains discipline and humanity in incredibly difficult circumstances. But what happens when leadership at the highest levels stops caring about those distinctions? When targeting civilian infrastructure becomes openly discussed policy, that moral erosion trickles down. If there are no rules at the strategic level, why should there be rules at the tactical level? In every war that lasts more than a few weeks, combatants start dehumanizing the enemy. It begins with demonization before the shooting even starts, painting the opponent as uniquely evil and dangerous. Then, when casualties start mounting, when your friends get killed, anger and desire for revenge take over. The enemy stops being human and becomes just targets. This is natural human psychology and the stress of combat, which is exactly why rules and moral frameworks are so important. They provide guardrails when emotions run hot, but if those guardrails are removed from the top, if leadership openly embraces total war targeting, then field commanders and individual soldiers lose the framework that's supposed to constrain their actions. The traditional military wisdom is that wars should be kept short when possible and fought for limited objectives. Right now, we're in something that should be limited but has morphed into something unlimited. The stated objective isn't narrow and achievable, it's regime change and complete destruction of an entire nation's capability. That's not a limited objective, that's total war. And total war against a nation of 93 million people protected by geography and armed with modern weapons is not something that gets resolved quickly or cleanly. It becomes grinding, it becomes brutal, and it creates consequences that ripple across the globe for years. Most Americans don't fully grasp this yet because the information is filtered and managed. Casualty numbers are kept low enough to avoid triggering public alarm. Economic impacts are downplayed or attributed to other causes. The connection between current military operations and future food shortages isn't made explicit, but more people are starting to figure it out. The dots are there to be connected for anyone paying attention. Unless there's a mass casualty event that forces the issue into public consciousness, this will continue until either objectives are somehow achieved or the costs become so obviously unsustainable that even managed messaging can't hide them. There's a dangerous myth at play here, the idea that air power provides victory without consequences, that you can bomb from altitude or launch missiles from safe distances and achieve strategic objectives without risking your own forces. It's been described as the appeal of decisive results without costs, but that hasn't worked out as advertised in this conflict. Aircraft have proven vulnerable, losses have occurred, and the opponent has demonstrated capabilities that challenge the assumption of safe standoff operations. Yet the belief persists because acknowledging reality would mean acknowledging that the entire strategy is flawed. As long as that myth is preserved, as long as decision makers believe they can achieve unlimited objectives with limited risk, we're going to continue down this path. And that includes a war that didn't need to be fought, certainly not by us, and definitely not for objectives that don't serve American interests. The real question is how long this can continue before reality forces a reckoning, before economic collapse or military catastrophe or public awareness breaks through the managed narrative. Because right now, we're watching something unprecedented unfold, a major power committing to total war for someone else's objectives while pretending it's a limited operation. And the rest of the world is watching too, taking notes, adjusting their own strategies based on what they're seeing. If the rules don't apply anymore, if civilian infrastructure is fair game, if economic warfare that causes mass starvation is acceptable, then everyone's calculations change. We may look back at this moment as when the international order that's existed since 1945 finally collapsed completely, when the lessons learned from the worst conflicts of the 20th century were forgotten and we decided to relearn them the hard way. That's what's really at stake here, not just the outcome of one regional conflict, but the entire framework of how nations interact and what constraints exist on the use of force. And most people scrolling through their phones tonight have no idea it's happening.